The fluorescent buzz of the diner made everyone look smaller. It flattered the chrome, chewed the edges off faces, turned the air into a metallic hush that swallowed talk. They called it O'Hara's, 2 stools at the counter for booths, a coffee pot that could leak a small river, and a chrome jukebox that had once been modern. It was a kind of place where stories waited on diner plates. It was also the spot where the town's petty tyrants liked to collect. He walked in like a man, trying to shrink himself to the size of the cash register. Skinny. God, ridiculously thin. Sleeves too long, shoulders like the edge of a broken ruler. His name tag read Elijah Moreno. The bell above the door exhaled. Conversation dodged him like water off a slick coat. He ordered coffee without looking up, voice small, precise. He sat where the corner booth met the wall and unfolded himself around that space like a paper character in a bigger scene. They noticed. Of course they did. People notice what doesn't fit. The bartender, a broad, tattooed man with the kind of face you wouldn't lend a dime to, gave him the kind of side eye that smells like inventory. Across from him, at the long table were 4 high school boys who never matured and 2 ex-pro footballers who refused to age held court. The scoffing started like rain. Small and sure would wash away. "Look at this new twig," muttered Marco, the loudest of them, a man with a jaw built like a box lunch and teeth that had been bought with other people's fear. "He looks like someone ate all the muscles and left the bones." They laughed. Nothing cruel that can't be covered with laughter in this town. It was a town laughter, cheap, reliable, and more dangerous than knives. Elijah lowered his eyes, fingers folded around the coffee mug like a prayer, and did nothing. That lack of retaliation fed them. They pulled out a deck of words, nicknames, imitations, the casual cruelty that comes from boredom and power. But then the jukebox hiccuped and landed on an old song, and in its pause, Elijah moved, not to respond to the taunts, not immediately. He dipped his face in the coffee, as if tasting it for a fault. When he spoke, his voice was the same flat, small baritone as before, but something in it made the air tilt. "You boys know how to behave in a diner, don't you?" he asked, not looking at Marco but at the silence around him. "Treat the staff with respect. Treat the old people with respect. Don't leave a mess when you're done." Marco snorted and said the cruelest thing he could find. "Or what? You gonna tell your mommy?" It was so predictable it may have been rehearsed. The room tightened. Elijah did not strike. He did not flip a table. He removed a business card from his wallet and placed it flat on the table between him and the mocking boys. The card was simple. No glitter, no fake titles. It read, Elijah Moreno, Moreno Enterprises. Under a phone number and a street address nobody in that diner knew. Marco flipped it, read it, and something in his laugh froze. The rest of the table watched for the fallout. They laughed louder. But there was a new sound in the room now. The click of a knife against a tooth, the hush of interest because possibility had entered. One of the older patrons, a woman named Agnes who had spent more time in the diner than most people had breathed, squinted at the card as if it might start vibrating. Marco shoved the card back with a hand that had stolen a few too many things from people's pockets over the years. "Boss of what? A street kiosk? A tax office," he said. Elijah smiled then. It was small and private, and when he told the story of his smile, later it would be called the kind that made you feel both cheated and relieved. "Whatever I want, I get," he said. "Mostly I want men to know their place." That statement was the kind that could mean anything. Marco's grin faltered. He felt exposed like a vendor with his stall ripped open. He jabbed his thumb at Elijah's chest, hard enough to make the thin skin rise. "You got any muscle, Twig?" Elijah did not flinch. He set his mug down, rose, and left enough space for silence to walk in after him. When he stood, the bell clanged and the door sighed. For a second, the boys expected him to limp out, to be gone like a bad dream. Instead, Elijah turned and looked at them once more, and the look in his eyes was less plea than ledger, a balance being checked. Then he walked away. They laughed when his coat disappeared through the door. They laughed to fill the hole he left. None of them saw the man in the dark sedan parked across the street until the engine purred, and the driver's hand waved from the passenger seat. The man watched the table. He watched Marco. A line of text, an implicit, ledger was being added somewhere. When Elijah's car, the sedan, pulled away later that morning carrying him in a paper grocery bag, the laughter in the diner had already bled into whispers. A city like this trades in stories. It trades them like currency. People fold them, crease them, place them in little stacks. The man who once beat the county champ, the mayor who bankrupted half a street, the owner of the textile mill who gave jobs and canceled paychecks. Elijah's card found its way into pocketed hands like a rumor that wants to be a fact. It would be the last time Marco laughed at something simple. 2 weeks later, Marco found a note tucked under his windshield wiper like a question with a sharp edge. It was hand-delivered in the night, printed on heavy paper and placed with enough ceremony that felt like an accusation. The note read, "Meet me at the old pier, 9 p.m. tonight. Come alone." Marco showed it to his friends like a man parading a wound and expected to be admired for surviving it. They made jokes at first, and jokes in this town are the same thing as courage because they are often the last offense before fear. But when the sun fell and the evening moved into the slow trudge toward midnight, the jokes turned silence. A strip of street lamps dragged long shadows across the pier. Marco went. If you're going to be punished in a movie, do it with bravado because the bravado buys you time to think of a way out. He wore his leather jacket like a fortress. He brought his brothers in jokes. A man named Jeff who could be counted on to start trouble, and a silent man named Rios who always carried a length of chain around his waist like a bad omen. Elijah waited at the end of the pier leaning on the rail as if the sea were his accountant. He was still thin, but because night mixes shadow and intention, he seemed drawn sharper. The water licked the pilings and smelled of fish in history. Marco stopped and laughed, the kind of laugh that is starting to slip. "You wanted to see me, Twig?" He shouted into the air like a man trying to reassert gravity. Elijah's hands remained in his pockets. He spoke with the calm of someone reciting terms of a contract. "Sit down." Marco and a companion sat on the creaking bench as if they were part of scenery. "Where's the muscle? Where's your puppets?" Elijah looked at Rios, then at Jeff, and then at Marco. He did not rise. He did not need to. He reached under the bench and pulled out a small, battered photograph. It was older than all of them, a black and white image of a warehouse and a group of men standing in front, suits like armor, a dock behind them. "Do you know that man?" Elijah asked. Marco squinted at the photograph. He knew the faces of this town. He knew the stories like pocket lint. "No." Elijah's jaw clenched once. "That's my father." Silence again. The photograph was a bridge. Bridges do not always carry you to safe places. You call me Twig. You call me names. You come into my town and think you can take what belongs to others. The cheap victories, the small humiliations. I don't want your money. I don't want your loyalty. I want one thing. Respect. Respect. Marco barked. "You got jokes, man." Elijah's voice folded the night. "Do you remember Luis Ortega?" he asked. "The bartender at O'Hara's who closed the place after 3 nights of your friends breaking spoons?" "Yeah, we broke spoons." "So?" "Luis opened his little bakery, and he closed it because of you. Mrs. Aguilar had a stroke when you blocked the ambulance with your truck. These are small things to a man like you, but ruins to the people who pay their bills." Jeff laughed, but the laugh had the brittle sound of glass about to shatter. Marco attempted a joke about being sorry, as if an apology could be tossed like change. Elijah let him. He let them talk until the tide had gone out, and the pier groaned, and their bravado felt smaller than the wind. Then Elijah did what people with ledgers do. He made a suggestion that felt like a verdict. He wanted Marco to give back what he'd taken, money, favors, apologies, and to do it by dawn. Simple audits, clean statements. Fail, and the town would learn the cost of keeping their petty kingdom. "You're bluffing," Rios mumbled, chain clinking. Elijah smiled that small smile again. He took a pen from his inside pocket and wrote something on the back of a receipt. He handed it to Marco. It had an account number, an address. The pen had scratched like a file on paper. It felt like proof. "Pay the people you hurt. Fix it. If you can't, I'll fix it for you. But from now on, you will know who you are messing with." They left shouting, promising themselves they would not be intimidated. They promised each other hamburgers and shots and more stories. They did not know that the photograph was a kind that unspooled other photographs, that each image led to another ledger, another name, another debt. As they walked away, someone on the pier, the only other soul in sight, watched them with eyes as flat as river stones. When Marco reached for his lighter and the night felt thinner, he found the receipt in his hand, and the address was a warehouse 2 blocks from the old textile mill. He knew the address because rumor had given it a history. Moreno Enterprises was rumored to be a real estate group, a front, something you could step around if you paid attention. Back at the diner, the boys found their mugs untouched. The bell over the door chimed as if marking a sentence. The morning paper didn't run the story. That meant nothing in a town where headlines were currency and omissions were deliberate. The ledger, Elijah's ledger, wasn't a book you could read at the library. It moved through people. Whispered apologies, returned watches, a handful of envelopes taped to the doors of those whose businesses had been damaged. Sometimes the envelopes contained cash. Sometimes they contained something worse, a picture, an invoice, the price of time wasted. Elijah returned to O'Hara's a week later. He slid into the same corner booth as before and watched. No one touched him. The boys who had mocked him kept their distance and joked about business cards. Marco's laugh sounded thin in the morning light. There was an early tremor in it. Words spread like grease on concrete. Moreno Enterprises hired a handyman to fix the diner's leaky roof without anyone asking. Louis the baker found a crate of pastries at his shop with a note. For the days you worked late and no one noticed. Agnes, the old woman, received a call from an attorney who said a long-lost pension had cleared her name and freed up a small sum. People began to tell the story in parts, and the parts rearranged into a new narrative. Elijah Moreno was no simple man. Backstory is a dangerous thing. It explains motives and hides intentions. Elijah's father's photograph had led to small archives, a warehouse, a ledger, then a scrap of a letter in Spanish about debts paid in favors. Old men in bars remembered the warehouse in black and white, a place of boxes and men who had shipping manifests and a way of making things happen. Elijah had been a skinny kid then, but his hands had been strong with making lists and keeping names. He had watched, learned how the town's small tyrants used joke laughter as currency and how the powerless bartered secrets. He remembered the night his father came home with 2 cigarette burns on his collar, and the way his mother never asked why. Memory becomes a muscle when you use it often enough. He rebuilt his life in the spaces between ledgers, in the accounts where small kindnesses were repaid with loyalty. He traded favors for favors and slowly made a map, not of violence but of leverage. The map was subtle. A man who could open a bank account in one town, and a back door in another. People who owed him were not indebted by violence, but by gratitude and necessity. He was patient in the way a creditor is patient. Marco's anger hardened into complaint. He tried to fight the tide by pressing his small crimes into bigger ones. A late-night break-in that left windows smashed at a rival shop. A rumor spread about a woman who would refuse him. Each step looked like dominance, but in the ledger, each had a price. Small tyrannies leave receipts. When the town's police chief met Elijah in his office, the meeting was sanitized, polite, cautious. Elijah asked questions about citations and permits, and whether the town had an ordinance against harassment. The chief, who had a face like a man who makes his home in gray areas, smiled and said the law was complicated. "Why are you doing this?" he asked at last. Elijah folded his fingers. "Because it's commerce, chief. People take without accounting. Folks deserve their receipts." "Sounds like extortion," the chief said. Elijah looked at him without anger. "If I set things right and people say thank you, who am I to argue?" Sometimes ledger keeping is just bureaucracy with a heartbeat. Sometimes it's vengeance dressed in paperwork. The town began to change in a way that looked like nothing at all. People who'd been pushed aside began to find small returns. A day's wages, an apology posted in a letterbox, a roof fixed. The change was deliberate, but it had consequences no one could have predicted. Marco found himself on the wrong side of public opinion slowly, the way tides turn. A local blogger, someone with more spite than a following, posted about Moreno Enterprises doing good deeds. People who had been victims began to speak, small voices swelling into a chorus. Marco found himself isolated, his friends keeping distance because the ledger had teeth. He tried to strike back. He arranged a graffiti to cover the windows of the bakery again. He called in a favor to get a truck in front of the ambulance route. He set up a campaign of small cruelties. Each time, the ledger corrected them. Envelopes returned at dawn. Apologies found their way onto doorsteps. Mr. Moreno's business tactics, if you could call them that, were as effective as a hired storm. No one saw the men who came at night, quiet as stepstones, not men in suits with guns, but repairmen with invoices and authors with pens. They fixed the things that were broken. They paid the damages. They left receipts. The town began to weigh what was owed and what was paid. But ledgers are not content with small satisfactions. They ask for balance when someone tries to accumulate more than their fair share. Marco's pattern of escalation finally produced one mistake so large it would become a hinge for everything that followed. A beating that landed a man in a hospital, a man unrelated to any old slight, someone who simply happened to be standing in the wrong corner when Marco and his friends decided to assert themselves. That man's name was Arnaldo. He had nothing to do with the original jokes. He was a delivery driver who wore a shirt 2 sizes too big because his mother had given it to him. The beating sent him into a coma for 3 days. When he woke, he had the cunning of a frightened animal and the memory of who had struck him. When Moreno's ledger found Arnaldo in the hospital, it made a new entry. Retribution was no longer purely symbolic. The ledger required a different currency. Consequence. Arnaldo's mother pressed a rosary until it hurt. The town's rumor mill fermented with opinions. Marco's friends argued about loyalty as if loyalty were a currency you could spend without saving. The hospital bills landed like missiles on Arnaldo's family. His partner took off with a suitcase of shame and broke what was left into smaller pieces. Elijah visited the hospital in the gray hours when the world is quieter and easier to weigh. He sat in the corridor and watched the fluorescent lights make the linoleum look like a stage. He did not burst in like a king. He sat. He signed a check that covered the hospital bills and left it on the bedside table with a small note. For the mistakes we do not make ourselves. This was a ledger's soft face. The bill was paid with no strings attached and no cameras. The family cried, bewildered and grateful. They did not know if they were being bought or saved. Marco's men panicked. They tried to vanish into the town's underside, but the ledger does not lose what it seeks. Men were discreetly approached. Offers of work, small bribes, even a chance to work off their debts cleaning up a construction site associated with Moreno Enterprises. The ledger reimbursed the town in odd ways, not by forcing blood, but by returning what had been taken, then asking for small reckonings. But Marco's pride would not yield. The more Elijah fixed, the more the petty tyrant sought to find another way to hurt him. Small humiliations, public taunts, a burned logo on one of Moreno's delivery vans. Each humiliation left a mark, and each mark drew a correction from a ledger. Marco was playing a game whose rules he had not read. He thought he was throwing stones. He had, instead, lit a trail that ended at a warehouse door under a street lamp. One night, a van exploded outside the warehouse. No one died, but the roar was enough to wake the neighborhood and make the newspaper. The town shook. Accusations began flying like shards. People pointed fingers. Marco, Jeff, Rios. Others said it was a coincidence, a faulty gas line. Nothing to see here. The police chief stared at the rubble and shook his head. We can't prove anything. It's circumstantial. Elijah watched from a distance. The ledger, when it scarred, did so with precision. He had no use for explosions. They were sloppy, and collateral damage will always be the ledger's enemy. He had drawn lines he did not intend to cross. Later that night, Marco found a photograph in his mailbox. The picture of the van before the explosion with a time stamp and a note on the back reading, "We take care of what we build. We don't tolerate burns." The message was clear and flattened Marco into a new kind of fear. The awareness that somebody could reach into his life with a camera and an address. He began to sleep badly. The ledger had become a mirror, and where Marco looked, he saw a man who had nothing left to bargain with but bravado. He began to lose friends. Jeff was offered a job in an adjacent county and accepted without asking why. He left on a bus in the dark of morning. Rios disappeared for weeks. When he came back, his chain was replaced by a plain bracelet, and he spoke less. The town's conversation shifted. People debated whether Moreno was a hero or a menace. They used words that had the easy slipperiness of opinions because it felt dangerous to take a side. At the cafe, Agnes said quietly to anyone who would listen, "He pays for what others break. That is not kindness, but sometimes kindness looks like armor." Whether she meant it as praise or warning depended on who listened. But the ledger had more layers. It tracked not only retribution, but leverage. Money moved in quiet channels. A developer who had been squeezing small business out of the old district suddenly found his permits delayed. A councilman who kept one hand in the cookie jar found it mysteriously cold as Moreno's influence shifted the balance of favors. Elijah's presence was no longer just a rumor. Meetings were held in offices and basements. Men who had once sneered at skinny boys began to ask their wives whether they should be polite to the more powerful. Invitations were sent, and responses were measured. Someone from the mayor's office asked politely, at a luncheon where soup cooled and conversation tasted like brass, if Moreno might be interested in funding a community center. Elijah said yes, and someone passed the salt. The ledger's tactics were messy to some and methodical to him. He wanted to rebuild the town according to a set of small ethics. Don't laugh at people's faces. Don't steal happiness for sport. Don't take what you do not intend to account for. He wasn't a savior. He was a man with a balance sheet and a deadline. But you cannot rearrange a town without making enemies. Marco's isolation curdled into fury. Fury is loud and useful when it has friends. When it has few friends, it becomes dangerous. It becomes desperate. Marco's final attempt to reclaim dominance was theater. He publicly humiliated a woman who ran a daycare, shouting slurs and making the children watch. The footage went viral locally and then beyond. The town, which had been sipping cautious opinions, spilled over into outrage. A protest formed outside his barbershop the next morning with signs that read, "Not in our town." That same day, an envelope appeared under Marco's door. It contained a single photograph. Marco at the pier, the night he had been summoned by Elijah. On the back, a single line, "There is still time to change." Anger took new forms. Marco rallied a few holdouts to break the protest. They were pushed back by citizens who had had enough. When the dust settled, Marco's barbershop had a broken window and a city citation for public disturbance. He woke that night like a man whose skeleton had been rearranged. The ledger had not only been moral but social. The town's social currency shifted, and what had once been tolerated no longer was. Marco's friends deserted him. There were threats now, whispered in phone calls with numbers that began to ring off deadlines. He felt the walls closing. When he lashed out at a rival who tried to mediate, he found himself battered in the alley behind the diner more brutally than any public humiliation could manage. He awoke in a hospital bed with bandages and two small men in dark coats sitting in plastic chairs. They introduced themselves as representatives of people who preferred pragmatic solutions. They offered Marco a simple choice: leave town quietly with enough money to start over, or stay and find what happens to men who make enemies of ledgers. Marco wanted to scoff. Pride tasted metallic. He took the money, but departure is never clean. 2 months later, Marco's younger brother, a man with a temper that was a poor reflection of his brother's bravado, returned to town to pick a fight with a man from a protest. He was found later with his jaw broken and a note tucked into his wallet. Learn to pay your debts. The family sued. The town talked. The story turned into 3 smaller stories: a lesson about power, another about redemption, and a rumor about who was pulling strings. The ledger grew teeth because people began to see that back in the ledger could be a safer path than living by cruelty. Elijah's name began to be used as a verb. Though Moreno that, people said in half-jokes, the phrase meant to fix a wrong quietly and firmly. That kind of language change is the hallmark of a man who has altered the town's grammar. But for all the reputation, there were lines Elijah would not cross. He refused payback that involved unnecessary suffering. When the deputy suggested a way to permanently silence a rival by fabricating charges, Elijah refused. "We don't make monsters worse to prove a point," he told him. "We fix the accounting, and then we close the books." There are people who believe in clean reconciliations, and there are men whose idea of reconciliation is more direct. The differences produce fractures. Men who wanted more than a changed town began to murmur. They wanted dominion, not audits. The fracture widened when a new player arrived, an old associate of Elijah's father, a man named Salvador Rizzo. He was a man with silvery hair and hands that had once ruled warehouses. He still smelled of oil and contracts. Rizzo had not been seen in this town for 20 years. His arrival was like a punctuation mark. He came with a small cadre and a set of intentions that were less about community and more about control. Rizzo sought the Ledger's partnership and found Elijah's restraint stifling. The man wanted to expand influence into gambling, protection rings, and other industries that required different ethics. He argued that power must be consolidated and profit extracted. Elijah listened with a patience earned by pain. Then he refused. The refusal was a quieter escalation than Marco's violence, but it was a match both sides could feel. Rizzo did not take rebukes politely. He began to test boundaries, pressing favors from contractors, nudging the councilmen, making investments that smelled like traps. When Rizzo's men set fire to a storage building belonging to a community center project that Elijah supported, a new ledger entry was made, but with blood on its edges. Men were hurt, not killed, but the message was clear. Rizzo was not interested in quiet corrections. He wanted dominion. Elijah faced the crux he had tried to avoid. Choose to expand the ledger's muscle into something harsher, or risk the town being shorn by men with teeth who mistook his restraint for weakness. He sat in his office late, the photograph of his father on the wall, the ink of his father's handwriting like an accusation. He weighed the cost of escalation, loss of the moral ground he'd fought to keep, possibility of innocent people getting hurt, the corruption of the ledger into vengeance. He picked up a pen and wrote 4 names on a piece of paper. They were men he had hoped never to press into service. He had trained others in negotiation and leverage, men who could do what had to be done. He placed the list in a drawer and closed it. It may have sounded like a latch locking. The war had become inevitable. The ledger's purpose had shifted from repair to defense. The town would not stay a neutral ledger ground if forceful actors sought to purchase it with fire. Elijah recruited with the same quiet that had defined him since the beginning. He did not paint signs or call meetings. He asked favors of people who had a ledger of their own. Women who ran small import shops offered warehouses for storage. A retired electrician fixed timers and alarms. A bus driver kept an eye on routes and reported suspicious cars. The town, half unwilling, half grateful, became a network stitched by favors and receipts. Rizzo escalated back. His men began to follow Moreno delivery trucks, noting routes and schedules. Annexations were suggested subtly. Bring your businesses into our umbrella, and the council will be more favorable. Politicians, who had once been on equal footing with the ledger's quiet influence, started to flinch. When a fight broke out in the market and a Rizzo lieutenant was stabbed with a broken bottle, the town knew it wasn't from Moreno's hand. The ledger had rules. Do not maim without cause. Do not kill unless necessary. The wound left a mark, and Rizzo responded with a list of his own: threats, bribes, and small arsons. The community center project had been the symbol of Moreno's soft power. It was supposed to be a place where kids could learn trades and parents could gather. After the arson, volunteers rebuilt. They moved bricks in the rain. Their determination made Rizzo angrier. He sent blackmail letters to city officials. He tried to stop fundraising efforts by disallowing permits. Each roadblock was a test. Elijah chose his response carefully. In one case, when Rizzo tried to force a contractor to sell his business to a frontman, Elijah arranged a rival offer that made the contractor whole and quietly bought the frontman out. Nobody saw the money move. The ledger had done what it always did: restore balance where possible. But Rizzo moved more dangerously. He kidnapped a man who had been known to keep accounts for Moreno, a young accountant named Diego who had a family, and a small boy who insisted on showing him his drawings at the end of each day. They took Diego to a warehouse and attempted to coerce him into falsifying records. Elijah watched the smoke of that warehouse like a man watching history burn. He didn't rush. He planned. He offered Rizzo a trade, stop the violence, and he would withdraw his interest in the gambling operations. Rizzo laughed and sent a photo of Diego tied to a chair, mouth gagged, eyes wide. The ledger shifted from quiet kindness to the need for rescue. 10 men in plain clothes moved through the shadows that night. They were not dressed to be seen. They were dressed to correct. They slipped into the warehouse with the calm of men who had done this before and found Diego shaken but alive. They left no one dead and no one tortured beyond tears. Diego was returned to his son the next evening, clutching a crayon drawing of a truck. He didn't know what had happened, and that was better. Rizzo struck back by placing a bomb under an empty lot owned by one of Moreno's partners. It broke windows and terrified a neighborhood, but again, killed no one. It was theater with an edge. People began to see gunmetal and contracts as two sides of the same coin. In response, Elijah took a step that felt like a sacrifice. He met Rizzo face to face at a neutral diner, the kind with low lights and ketchup bottles, and offered the man a chance to stop. The meeting was tense. Rizzo insisted the town belonged to force. Elijah answered that the town belonged to people who paid their debts. It was an argument about ethics in a language that had been poisoned by ambition. Rizzo left the dinner smiling like a man who had planted a seed. The smile meant he had heard the plan and was ready to watch it sprout. He increased pressure on politicians. He offered to fund a mayoral campaign if his demands were met. He leaked a document about Moreno's past involvement in some shady logistics in another state. The ledger's reputation wobbled. People whispered about Moreno's antecedents and whether his father's warehouse had been involved in anything illegal. The press sniffed. Local pundits debated whether the man who returned money to the downtrodden might be managing a darker portfolio. Elijah felt the ground shift, the ledger turning from a community practice to a public spectacle. He prepared for what would come next. Legal scrutiny, political attacks, and the risk that men like Rizzo would leverage town impatience to throw him out. He fortified his accounts. He placed his records in a lawyer's lockbox. He made sure every receipt for every payment could be traced. When Rizzo's campaign went public, with billboards implying Moreno was a criminal using philanthropy for cover, the town's mood cracked. Conversations that had been favorable started to include doubt. The ledger was now being translated by new voices, pundits, helicopter news, and talk shows that preferred sensation over nuance. Elijah had not wanted the ledger to become a headline, but headlines have a way of turning ethics into sound bites. He prepared his defense the only way he knew how, ledger by ledger, receipt by receipt. He instructed his team to compile proof of every payment, every corrected wrong. The records were meticulous, the kind that made auditors sigh. He realized then that the ledger had to survive in court as well as on the street. The battle for the town had moved from alleys to city halls. The question now was, could paper and proof protect a man who had always relied on favors and quiet thank yous when the world demanded louder evidence? When prosecutors subpoenaed Moreno Enterprises, the courtroom smelled like bleach and shoe polish. Cameras lined the hallways, and reporters murmured like swarms. Rizzo watched in the back row with a smugness that was almost genteel. He wore a suit with a pin that said, "Give me more." It seemed tasteless to some and accurate to others. Elijah sat in the front row with his legal team, calm as a man who has balanced more precarious books. He knew the ledger's bones, receipts, signatures, timelines. He had made sure each act of restitution had paper. He had anticipated attack and hedged against it. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who practiced philanthropy as a cover for coercion. Threats thinly veiled his offers, favors traded for control, a string of men who had had no choice but to comply. Rizzo supplied a parade of witnesses who spoke in low, conspiratorial tones about Moreno's past and about illicit shipments in another state. The old rumor turned legal rumor. Elijah's defense was a slow, methodical counter. Receipts for payments, bank transfers matched repairs, testimony from business owners who had their doors fixed, and bills paid without any conditions. He produced Diego, who testified about a rescue that looked less like a kidnapping and more like a misinterpretation. He provided logs that showed Moreno's company had no licenses to run gambling operations. The jury listened like a public weighing machine. They were human. They had families and opinions and a bias toward stories. It was hard to see the ledger as anything but either a noble accounting or a soft criminality. The press relished the gray. Rizzo's men tried to rile the courtroom with an accusation that struck deep. They claimed Moreno had once arranged for the intentional burning of a rival's van. There was smoke, but the evidence was circumstantial. Moreno's lawyers dismantled the claim, showing that the van had been insured and that the claimant had a financial incentive for the fire. They produced invoices, timestamps, and an email trail that suggested the claimant had an interest in making Moreno look guilty. Outside, protesters split into camps, those who chanted Moreno, and those who shouted guilty. Inside, witnesses told small stories of lives altered by returned wages and repaired windows. The jurors took notes like men tallying beans. The judge moved like a man who had seen too many dramas and slept badly because of them. Then, on the third day, someone leaked a photograph of a ledger long thought destroyed, a photograph that placed Moreno's father at the center of an old smuggling scheme. The photograph was crude and old and smelled like rumors that had traveled in shoe boxes. It was enough to nudge public opinion. People who once smiled at Moreno's checks now frowned and wondered what else they didn't know. The defense called an expert in forensic accounting who traced each payment with such cold clarity that it read like a map of righting wrongs. Men who had been forced to sell businesses under pressure testified about receiving unexpected offers of help from Moreno's group after their misfortune. The defense painted a picture of a man using influence to repair social abuses. Rizzo's final witness was Salvador Rizzo himself, the silver-haired man with a voice slick like oil. He spoke of power and necessity and suggested the town needed guardians with teeth. His rhetoric cooked on low heat. He never said Moreno had committed outright crime. He only implied it, left the implication to fester. The jury retired. The town held its breath. Elijah walked to the courthouse steps and smelled the rain. He did not look like a man certain of victory. He looked like a man whose life had been an accounting and who had placed every receipt on a table. 3 days later, the jury returned. Guilty or not guilty. The word felt like tectonic plates shifting under the town. They announced their verdict. Not guilty on major charges. Guilty on a single misdemeanor related to an unlicensed advertisement. The courtroom exploded with mixed reactions. Elijah's legal team had managed to keep him out of the grave accusations. The misdemeanor cost him a fine and gave Rizzo talking points to the papers. Yet the town's ledger had, in many ways, been vindicated. The judge admonished both sides and suggested the town needed better discourse. For Rizzo, the verdict was a partial win. He had the misdemeanor and the attendant smear. For Elijah, it felt like a strange victory. He had kept the worst charges off the book, but his reputation bore scars. The ledger survived but was alterable. The town had been forced to look at itself and its appetite for spectacle. Rizzo's face didn't fall. He saw opportunity in half-truths. The months after trial didn't calm the town. They only pushed the tension underground, like flames hiding under floorboards. The headlines died down, but the whispers sharpened. Elijah could feel it every time he walked into a room. People respected him, yes, but they also feared what might come next. Rizzo had lost the courtroom battle, but not the war. Men like him never lose. They simply move into the shadows and wait for the balance to shift. He began testing the town with quieter weapons. Misinformation, fabricated debts, anonymous tip-offs about non-existent crimes. Small manipulations that made the town second-guess their trust in Elijah. He placed doubts like landmines. The worst one was aimed at Diego. One cold evening, Diego's son, a kid whose drawings Elijah kept like trophies of hope, didn't come home from school. His backpack was found outside the playground fence, neatly zipped. No ransom note, no witness, no tracks. The town froze. Every parent felt the air and their lungs turned to stone. Police searched until sunrise. Volunteers fanned out like a terrified army. Elijah did not panic, but his hands shook once, only once, when he picked up the boy's drawing pinned to the community center wall. A truck, a sun, and a stick figure man with EJ above the head. A message arrived at Moreno Enterprises at 3:12 a.m. No signature, no threats, no demands. Just, a ledger is useless if you cannot protect what trusts you. It was Rizzo's handwriting. Elijah could feel the old part of him, the one he'd buried under receipts and reforms, rising like a tide. The part that remembered what his father taught in the warehouse. If cruelty takes from you, you take back more. But he had vowed not to become that man. Instead, he used a ledger. Quietly, he summoned every old ally he'd ever helped. The mechanic he saved from bankruptcy, the baker whose shop he rebuilt, the teachers he supported, the unemployed youth he trained. Within hours, the entire town became a search grid. Eyes in every alley, ears in every bar, cars patrolling streets like a second police force. By sunrise, someone spotted a black van near the abandoned textile mill, the kind Rizzo's men often used. Elijah got there before the police. His heart hammered, but his steps were steady. Inside the mill, he found Diego's son, cold, scared, but unharmed, hiding behind a crate with a flashlight clutched like a lifeline. There was no kidnapper, no rope, no trap, just a recording device placed on a stool. It clicked on. Rizzo's voice spilled to the speakers like venom wrapped in velvet. Your town trusts you. Elijah, I wanted to see how far that trust goes. Consider this a reminder. You're still just a man, and men lose things. Elijah crushed the recorder under his shoe. The ledger had a new entry now, a personal one. But he did not retaliate, not with blood, not with force. Instead, he carried the boy home, wrapped him in a coat, and stayed with him until Diego arrived and collapsed into sobs. The town saw all of it, and in that moment, the balance shifted, not through fear, but through loyalty. Spring came late that year, but when it did, the community center opened in full. Children ran through the halls. Parents smiled with a relief they hadn't felt in years. The town had changed, not because of fear, but because people learned to stand up together. Elijah didn't want a stage, but they pushed him forward anyway for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Diego's son stood next to him, holding the scissors with small, determined hands. As cameras clicked, Elijah spoke, not as a mafia boss, not as a savior, but as a man who had learned the cost of leadership. Respect and fear look the same from far away, he said softly. But up close, only one of them makes a place worth living in. So from today forward, our ledger stays open, and everyone gets to see the numbers. The crowd cheered. Parents hugged their kids a little tighter. Rizzo watched from a distance, leaning against a parked car, arms folded, a cigarette burning between two fingers. He didn't look defeated. He looked calculating. When the crowd thinned, he flicked the cigarette to the ground and smirked. You're building something nice, he said. Elijah didn't look at him. It's not yours to burn. For now, Rizzo replied. Balance shifts. It always does. Elijah finally met his eyes. Calm, unflinching. That's why I keep the ledger open. Rizzo smiled, not mocking, not angry. More like a man who'd finally found a worthy opponent. We'll see who it protects in the end. He walked away. But for the first time since the trial, the town watched him go. Not Elijah, because they knew who they trusted now. And they knew who they would stand with. Elijah wasn't a saint. He wasn't a tyrant. He was something far more powerful. A leader with community behind him. A man whose ledger didn't balance fear and power, but accountability and loyalty. The suspense didn't end that day. Because men like Rizzo don't disappear. They wait. They plot. They return. But this time, Elijah wasn't alone. And the town wasn't afraid. Sometimes victory isn't the end of the story. It's just the moment everyone finally understands whose side they're on.